Welkom bij het 8 uur journaal. Dit is weer een pre-recording en vandaag nemen we jullie mee naar het zonnige Afrika. En speciaal daarvoor hebben we een Nick van de organisatie Pandata. Hi Nick.
Hi there, how are you?
Je verstaat een beetje Nederlands, want je spreekt Afrikaans, maar ik denk dat het makkelijkste is...
Ja, mijn Afrikaans is heel beter dan mijn Nederlands. Maar wanneer het komt naar die technische termen, verkies ik Engels.
Oké, dan zullen we het gewoon in het Engels doen.
Yeah.
So, please, Nick, tell us something about who you are and what you do and how you got involved in the resistance.
Well, I'm actually a very boring investor. I do private equity investing here in South Africa. My background by way of training was as an actuary, somebody who deals with risk and probability and statistics and the time value of money and that kind of thing. So I guess that's tangentially related to the study of epidemics and their impact. But my real concern simply was a social one. At the very beginning, I could see immediately that there was a massive gap between what the media was saying and what the facts on the ground were. The media was acting out as if we had an airborne Ebola on our hands and everybody was going to die. And the facts on the ground were exactly the opposite. This looked like a disease that to which very few people were susceptible in the first place. And then the only ones, for the most part, who would generate severe disease and have a risk of death were elderly and severely comorbid people. We got that read as early as February 2020. And this was completely ignored. And everybody in the media were making out that children were at risk and anybody was susceptible and so on. So when the lockdown started happening, I became even more worried. By then I was talking to a group of professional friends, immunologists, economists, lawyers, and when South Africa locked down, we said, this is insane, for developing countries to attempt to lock down when they don't have social safety nets. This is absolutely insane. How's anybody letting this happen? And we decided to do something about it. And we wrote a paper called Quantifying the Years of Life Lost to Lockdown. And that was an attempt to just say, come on, people. Somebody out there, please do a cost-benefit analysis. And we couldn't see anybody else doing one. Funnily enough, there was one government in the world that did a cost-benefit analysis, and that was yours. The only thing was that exercise showed what our exercise showed, which was that the costs and public health consequences of lockdown were massively in excess of any potential consequences of the disease. But that study was buried, hidden from the public eye until a Freedom of Information request brought it to light. And that was our finding. Our finding was that we expected that the public health consequences of the lockdown would be at least 30 times as bad as the consequences of the actual epidemic. And we published that, wrote some newspaper articles to bring it to public attention. And that attracted a lot of attention. And it was in that exercise that this organization, PANDA, which is short for Pandemics Data and Analytics, was born. And we carried on being a South African-focused organization for the next 6 months, taking us up to October 2020. And by that time, we realized that nothing we were doing was making any difference because our government was doing everything under the air cover of the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so we decided to internationalize PANDA. And over the years since that decision, PANDA's now grown to have members in 30 different countries or more worldwide, hundreds of members, scientists in all disciplines, support people who do a lot of the operational and communications and graphics type work. So it's become quite a beast. I had no idea it was going to turn into this. I thought we were going to write a paper and everybody would come to their senses and we'd stop this lockdown nonsense. But it's such a political thing. This has nothing to do with public health. That's the most important thing for your listeners to understand, is this isn't about public health. This is a political action first and foremost. with what should have been a very mild, low impact epidemic being used as cover for political agenda.
I agree with you completely, but how is it possible that all the countries in the world joined this? And you briefly mentioned it. South Africa, in many metrics, is still a developing country. What would be the benefit of that country to follow such a troublesome and damaging political agenda?
Well, there's incredible pressure on countries. We saw that when Sweden decided not to lock down, or rather the Swedish public health officials decided. I think the politicians would have if they could have. But we saw what happened. The Guardian, which is a Gates Foundation sponsored newspaper, wrote an article every 2 days about the murderous Swedes, and there was immense pressure put on that country. There are all sorts of financial inducements. There are, agreements signed with various organizations that are kept out of the public eye. And there's also been a lot of propagandization of the notion of the epidemic being extremely bad and lockdowns being extremely good and the vaccines being extremely good. That is propaganda. It's not stuff that's based on fact. It is weaponized fabrication that has been rolled out through a very, very controlled mainstream media campaign. We don't have independent media when it comes to mainstream outlets. They're all controlled by a handful of individuals, and they have gladly propagated the kind of perspectives of a technocratic elite that is hell-bent on utilizing these hitherto unutilized policy responses. And they simply do not stack up with the facts on the ground. It was evident from May last year that lockdowns were not saving lives. If anything, they were worsening the situation. And I'm talking about COVID lives there, not, when it comes to all-cause mortality. Of course, lockdowns are very, very destructive. But that's been clear for a year and a half, and yet governments ignore the data, ignore their original pandemic respiratory virus guidelines, ignore the basic lessons of public health and medicine, and carry on with these insane practices all around the world. And that has to be understood in the context of a political agenda which has spawned an unprecedented amount of propaganda and lots of political pressure on countries to conform with what is perceived to be the kind of lockstep imperative.
Absolutely. And when we see countries almost breaking away, then agencies or unions like the European Union crack down on them. And there's no escape from deviating from the path that is in line with the narrative.
Yes.
So,
yes, it's deeply evil stuff.
Yeah. In South Africa, there's a very big heterogeneity within the populace. And I'm not only talking about race, but I'm also talking about education level. I'm also talking about culture. I'm also talking about income and economic standards. So how is this? I can imagine that the wealthy elite can still survive, but the people on the ground that get daily income, how can they survive this?
The idea that you could lock down the townships in South Africa was always completely ridiculous. And so what you had was a situation where probably 80% of the population had no capacity to lock down. And I saw it. Whilst the journalists and newspaper editors were all hiding under the bed, locking down and Zooming and hiding themselves away from the so-called deadly virus, we were out and about. And when I visited the townships from the very early days, it was quite clear that nothing was really being observed in terms of regulations. And so the result was that most of the country didn't lock down except for the economic engine, which is crazy. So they shut down, vast swathes of the economy. Tourism, of course, was completely on ice, which is a big portion of our economy. all the restaurants and small businesses that provide entertainment and services for the general public were forced to close. But in the townships, people hustle. They have to survive. And so that interaction of people never stopped. The mobility went down for a couple of days, and then it was back up again. And people there, they called bullshit on the whole escapade very early on. Within weeks, that nobody was wearing a mask, nobody was social distancing, there was no sanitizing or hand washing and all that stuff going on. They simply interacted. And the result has been that we've had two different types of epidemic. In the poorer areas, they had their first wave, took it on the chin, and now they're all immune and they're not suffering. Whereas in the wealthier areas, there was some suppression of spread from the lockdown and personal isolation, and then that came back in successive waves, and it just doesn't go away. So, but my view is actually that the poorer people did better than the wealthy because of this. We sit here making sure that every single person will eventually be exposed, rather than letting the thing pass through and go away. So it's been really appallingly managed, and we've had very bad all-cause mortality outcomes. So because of the denial of service that has happened in South Africa, probably as bad as the worst places in the world. All people have been dying of all sorts of other things. There have been widespread reductions in income, which has a very big public health consequence that will be with us for decades, if not generations. All sorts of normal clinic practices have been terminated. People who are on managed HIV and tuberculosis programs dropped off the programs. Cancer screening stopped being done. Prenatal care dropped off a cliff. So, just the normal basic public health practices with respect to diseases, which are far, far more consequential than COVID, were brought to a standstill. So it has been a public health and social catastrophe. There is no shying away from that. And I squarely blame the World Health Organization and these large international organizations with their grandiose romantic ideals of, almost as if we're in a movie like Contagion or something like that, and they're going to save the world, save the universe, win a Nobel Prize. These people are despicable and they've done the wrong thing.
Yes, and there's no turning back anymore, because everybody sees the damage is enormous. So they have to follow through. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They have to make sure that it is horrible. So later on they can say, well, it was very horrible, so we had to do what we could do.
Yes.
But you mentioned a few things. HIV, unfortunately, South Africa is quite known for it. And of course, starvation and famine. If people don't eat because of the lockdown, and even if it's not starvation but malnutrition, then of course the immune system suffers. You get all other kinds of outbreaks and ailments. How did that go in South Africa?
Well, the HIV story is particularly interesting, and it's my belief that there will be a closer look at what exactly has gone on with the management of the HIV epidemic in South Africa, because all the same characters who have been so largely represented in this debacle around COVID, Fauci and his minions, were involved in the HIV and antiretroviral rollout in South Africa. And, I remember as a young man working in a reinsurance company, seeing these models projecting enormous deaths from HIV if they were correct, and they weren't correct. We got nowhere near it. I remember we sat there pricing group life insurance products at 20 times what was actually going to happen. And so, overcharging massively. And so it's really quite notable for me that the same criminals, because that's what they are, were involved in that story as are now involved in this one. Tuberculosis is a huge problem, yes. And that's a disease which you really want to manage. If you don't manage it, it can become hugely debilitating and deadly. And, so that's a big issue. But all over the world, what this policy response has done is result in the greatest increase in inequality that the world has ever seen. I mean, the numbers are staggering. It dwarfs any prior attempt to concentrate wealth in the hands of the wealthy. And that has rolled out in South Africa in a very extreme way. People like me, I'm an investor now. I have my own business. I invest in mid-sized companies. People like me have seen their wealth, go soaring. Every time I open a statement, it's gone up because there's all the resources that are being thrown into propping up the markets, and maintaining the well-being of the wealthy elite. And it's a bit of a sickening feeling, because that what's happening on the ground is that people are losing their jobs and really struggling out there in the face of these capricious and nonsensical policy pronouncements that have dogged this whole experience. It's really sickening, and I battle to control my emotions when I talk about it, because this has been obvious from before the lockdown. This was a predictable outcome. It is ridiculous. That is why all the guidelines prior to COVID ruled these measures out. They said it explicitly that the social cost would be too high. And so the World Health Organization has been persuaded by the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and all these Johns Hopkins University type places, who are universities that are largely on the payroll of big pharma, who want to sell vaccines regardless of the consequences. And they've rolled out this shocking response. People need to go to jail.
Absolutely. I think we can all agree, but we haven't seen the end yet.
No.
Specifically, the 24th of November, South Africa made a statement, please stop sending Pfizer and Johnson injections. We had enough. And I think at that moment, it was stated that there was 30% of the population was partly or fully vaccinated. But then the 25th of November, the WHO declared a variant of concern, being the Omicron, the new South African variant.
Yes. Two things about that. First of all, the declaration of any variant at all is a political act. Your viruses mutate on a continuum. They mutate all the time. And it's really is nonsense to be naming these things when, before you even know whether they're clinically relevant. Now, as a matter of fact, it does appear that Omicron is clinically relevant, but in a favorable way. It's mild. We're not seeing anywhere near, it's at 95, 99% less or fewer hospitalizations per case. This is really like a mild cold. And so to even label this as a variant in the first place was a political...
I believe this is South Africa. And this talks about the case fatality rate. Of course, it is a bit skewed in that sense, because it's very dependent on how much you test. But it's very clear that it dropped off a cliff.
Yeah, it dropped off a cliff. And the case hospitalization rate is even more strongly down, we have most of our testing in admissions, hospital admissions. There's not a lot of this crazy saturation testing.
Yes, and that's why you see the normal CFR, a case fatality rate. This means normally when you test, you only test when people have symptoms and when they need help. And then 3 to 4% is not a strange number. If we look at Holland, we have a CFR of 0.9 or 0.8, because we test an enormous amount of people who do not need help and do not have any complaints. And that's just for the viewers to explain the difference, why there is such a large difference.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just totally clear now. This variant has actually been around for at least a month. And it's not showing any sign of being dangerous to anybody, really. And I always say, people say, oh, but somebody died or whatever. Well, no, we need to have thresholds for what we describe as deadly and dangerous. And, in South Africa, we have all-cause deaths of about 1,500 a day. And we have averaged something, it's in single digits for quite some time now, that are deaths with COVID. Or even then, it's the wrong description. It's actually deaths with SARS-CoV-2. many of the people, dying or at least whose deaths are being attributed to COVID don't actually have the disease COVID. They have the presence of nucleotides from the virus in their blood when tested using a PCR test that is 1 billion times more powerful than needed to diagnose infectiousness. So it's a really quite laughable and ridiculous situation. And of course, what happened was not only did they name it a variant, but they named it a variant of concern with absolutely no facts at hand to justify doing so, other than the number of mutations on the spike protein. But mutations can be favorable. They can disable the virus or make it less virulent. And in fact, that's what you expect with the passing of time, that virulence will go down and transmissibility will go up. And so the World Health Organization's actions, yes, I think given how poorly they've behaved in this epidemic and the atrocious public health decisions that they have supported or stayed silent about, I think you have to actually assume the worst, which is that they did this deliberately in order to maximize pressure on South Africa to continue injecting every arm in sight.
Exactly, because I think it was a public health official who said, well, this is a very mild variant from the beginning when it was declared, and still the whole world started to shut down again because of Omicron. So now it's becoming a running gag, but it is very unfortunate that the narrative still continues, although it was debunked in that sense within 1 or 2 days.
Yeah, I mean, a 2-minute video clip on YouTube the other day, simply reporting the facts like you did now, graphs like this from South Africa, was deplatformed from YouTube. There's this tendency to want, well, it's not tendency, it's the dishonest practice of willfully and deliberately lying to the members of the general public. I mean, if you watched Boris Johnson yesterday addressing the English people, he said, "Ooh, we've had a death, so we can no longer be spreading the story that it's a mild virus." No details about the death. Was it a death from somebody who's dying of cancer while positive with Omicron? No, just as long as we are maximizing perceived threat and justifying the most draconian of actions, then these crazy politicians are happy. But they're liars, all of them, and they have been for 2 years. And I wish the population would wake up to this fact. It's just unbelievable for me how in the UK, everybody goes, no, we better shut down. We better close Christmas, cancel all the school plays. Let's not have dinner together. What is wrong with people?
Well, I think a lot of people are scared, not necessarily about the virus anymore, but scared about admitting they were wrong and admitting that we are now living in a totalitarian regime. But having said that, many people are waking up. I'm at the police office every week, filing charges against judges, against members of politics, because I think this is our civil duty. If you see a crime, you have to report a crime. And I see such a change even in the police office, where they used to wear masks and kept distance and didn't shake hands. Everything's back to normal. So that gives me great hope, actually.
Yeah, well, that is wonderful. I'm so pleased to hear that you're perceiving that in your country, because it's difficult for us to gauge, sitting in the executive committee of PANDA, exactly what is going on the ground, because we get such, there's such polarized reporting. The people in the skeptics community who've been frustrated and trying to raise the alarm, finding themselves censored for 2 years, they will often amplify the very worst stories, the stories about Austria and Germany and Australia and Canada and all the insane authoritarian things that they're doing. And then you'll get people calling you from Germany saying, "Listen, I'm thinking about emigrating because this is getting so ridiculous. What's it like in South Africa?" So we get those stories, but when you read the mainstream media, they never report about the massive protests that have been happening. I mean, the largest single protest in the history of man went unreported anywhere in the world in mainstream media. That's how bad things have gotten. It's just this willful obfuscation of the truth and a completely bogus narrative. When I say completely bogus, every single element every single key element of the coronavirus narrative is false.
Absolutely. But I think the regime with the minions in the media are actually going in overdrive. And that
Yes.
feels to me very encouraging, that more and more people are waking up because of the overdrive.
Good. I always thought this would happen, because what they've done is so bad, so wrong, and they have so committed themselves to it. There's no turning around. So I once said, look, Gaddafi is a good measure for what happens to people who do this kind of thing. And I was kind of joking, but there was an element of truth in it. I think these people will mostly eventually end up having to go into exile or face prison sentences, that kind of thing, because the fingerprints
if they're
all over
lucky,
the place.
if they're lucky, because when chaos turns, it becomes a beast, and it can turn on them as well.
Yes, I agree with that perspective as well, that these things become volatile and unpredictable. When the man in the street wakes up to the extent to which he's been lied to, it could go anyway. There's a very wide funnel of doubt. And I desperately hope that it doesn't become violent, because that won't help anything. But, it's all on them if it does, because this level of insanity is just breathtaking. I mean, we have been spending 2 years putting the data and the facts in front of policymakers, and they turn a blind eye. Scott Atlas was saying the other day, the story was recounted by Peter McCullough in his interview with Brett Weinstein, which, by the way, I recommend everybody should listen to, McCullough and Weinstein on the Dark Horse podcast. But he was saying that he had had dinner with Scott Atlas, and Scott Atlas said when he was in the administration that all of these guys, Fauci and Fauci's minions, and Walensky and them, would arrive at these meetings with no science, no journal articles and papers or studies. They were just arriving and making stuff up. There was no reference to the actual risk, the actual clinical knowledge. And they were running their program off an agenda that had been set in isolation from COVID. It has nothing to do with the epidemiology or medical characteristics of COVID. And I think that was, that was true in South Africa as well. Let me give you an example. We have a law case on the go right now, which is contesting the approval of the mRNA vaccine, Pfizer's one, for use in children. Government responded with a 493-page document. In that entire 493-page document, they referenced only 10 scientific papers, one of which was published after they had made their decision. There isn't a single page which represents a minute or a discussion note from the actual engagement of the public health officials who were responsible for this sign-off. And their case looked so abysmal and weak that within a couple of days, guess what happened? The United Nations comes over the horizon. They're joining the case as a amicus in an amicus brief, amicus curiae, meaning a friend of the court. So they could see that there was a real risk that the government would lose this case and have to retract the approval of the vaccines for children, which, by the way, is despicable. I mean, we know it's
not only despicable; it is a crime, because it is in conflict with multiple points of the Nuremberg Code.
Yeah. They are stealing health from children in order to have a theoretical chance of protecting the vulnerable. That's the best argument you can give them. I think actually the accurate one, because they know very well that the actual protection that results, for some, in theory, for some old person as a result of vaccinating children who by and large immune anyway, is terribly small. This is actually about following the instructions of their pharma stakeholders. And they all have them. There isn't one regulatory organization in this country that doesn't receive money from vaccine stakeholders. And so they are stealing health from children in order to please their vaccine stakeholders.
Absolutely. So in Africa, in the 90s, there was, of course, a big atrocities going on in Rwanda. And why I bring this up, it showed what can happen when the media propagates hate speech. Do you see this polarization going on? Because everywhere we see heads of state or leaders of government talk about the pandemic of the unvaccinated. And this is very dangerous stuff.
Well, I think the reason we have had such low take-up of vaccines is not because there weren't vaccines available, and it's not because it was difficult to get one. People do not want to be vaccinated. 70% of the population are just simply saying no. And that's despite an incredible amount of pressure by some employers to mandate vaccination. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I think in particular, the large Black population, which I forget the percentage that it represents of the South African population right now, but it's the vast majority of the population. They have seen tyranny and authoritarianism before, and they're not interested in it. They see the vaccine passport coming, and it looks exactly like what was called the Dom Pass, or the apartheid racial ID document that was required to move around if you were a person who wasn't white. So this is all sounding a little bit eerie, a little bit familiar, and I think with reason, because it just as apartheid was a discriminatory set of laws and regulations without any relationship to reality, so too this whole idea of mandatory vaccination does not relate to the science, and it has no basis in reality. I mean, we have a situation where 70 or 80% of our population has already been infected. There is nothing to be gained in any measurable way from vaccinating them.
Even if it were real working and effective vaccines, there would be no public health.
Even if they were working, yes, it would be ridiculous.
Yeah.
And nobody's done a cost-benefit analysis. This very important calculation that you're meant to perform every time you make a decision about whether to roll out a vaccine, not some of the time, not occasionally, every single time, and for every single age group, which is called number needed to vaccinate, so that you can make a cost-benefit analysis. I have not seen a single government anywhere in the world perform that calculation.
We actually sued the specific council, and it was turned down by the judge. She refused to give a real verdict about it. So that was actually why I was at the police station to file charges against this judge. It is amazing that this cost-benefit analysis, which is one of the criteria in all these councils, is just ignored. They don't do it.
That's why people have to wake up. You know, when that kind of thing starts happening, you're talking about judicial capture. You're talking about a level of irrationality which can only be the product of a political agenda and propaganda, ideology distillation, you know. And people have to start seeing this. This is not public health. Nobody's practicing public health. Nobody's even pretending anymore.
So specifically in South Africa, are people referring to it as the apartheid pass? Because here in Holland, we do that, and people get very agitated from the other side. Tomorrow, we have a case against the leader of the opposition, who speaks out firmly against apartheid, but also compares it to the pre-Holocaust era in the 30s and 40s. And now he's actually being sued for comparing that. Now, I know my friends in Israel are constantly comparing it to the Second World War. Are people in South Africa comparing it to apartheid?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Vera Shava, one of the Holocaust survivors, is comparing it to the Holocaust and saying that it's worse. And I agree with her. So, what this exercise is telling us is how easy it is for these social phenomena to take hold, how ordinary people become the agents of great evil. And this is, I believe, something that ought to be compared to the Holocaust, ought to be compared to apartheid, because there's so many mechanisms and so many features that are in common. We saw the other day these stories of German school kids being, if you have to go up and stand up in front of the class and announce your vaccination status. 60, 70, 80 years ago, 90 years ago, they were having to stand up and, announce their ethnic status.
I can concur. By the way, I had a mom tell me that it happened in Holland as well with her children.
Yes. Yeah. This stuff, the parallels are startling, and people who cannot see it need to just catch a wake up, because I know it's now become like a defense mechanism. You can't compare anything to those things, because people have perception that there were these evil ogres who did those things. Those things were done by ordinary people, just like the evil things that are being done now. And they are evil. I mean, we're talking about people's basic civil liberties being taken away from them when they constitute no risk to anybody at all. Even if they did constitute a risk, it would be wrong. And we know that. We have these codes, the Nuremberg codes, the Syracuse principles, the Helsinki Accord. You know, people died and went to prison and fought wars to establish these principles. And they're being torn up and thrown into file 13 by a bunch of pointy-headed bureaucrats with absolutely no concept of ethics, morality, and how the world is for most people. They sit in ivory towers or in their swanky offices at multinational corporations, just ruling from on high. It's sick.
Another question. Are you familiar with the Crimson Contagion exercise?
Yes, that's one. I can't remember which is which because they all have these woo spooky kind of.
So this was an exercise. A lot of people point out event 201. What there was a larger event preceding it, run by Fauci and his minions.
Yes, I'm familiar with
January
that one.
2019 to August 2019, where they actually played this whole game. And I feel that the changes they made to the protocols were based on this exercise. But do you believe that this is a planned exercise, or is this just opportunistic behavior?
No, this has got elements of planning and opportunism and accident. We see this type of exercise, Crimson and Event 201 and others, going back for decades. So they were role-playing and wargaming these responses, which were kind of completely separate from what their own guidelines said, you know. So the UK's guidelines are, you know, any country that had a pandemic respiratory virus guideline, those guidelines said, don't do those things that they were wargaming and practicing. And the pedigree of these events is ancient, really. They go back to the late 60s. So there was this kind of warped, militarized conceptualization of a pandemic response, that these kind of super edged up would-be medical tyrants were kind of drooling about. Ooh, it would be so cool if we could do this. And now they got their chance. I think there was much more planning than people are willing to admit. But you can't call it a conspiracy. That's what I keep on saying, is it's just wrong to call a person who suggests that there's too much centralization of control, that these guys were planning to do things that weren't in the guidelines, that Bill Gates has too much influence in global healthcare. None of those are statements of conspiracy. They're statements of fact. And it's a matter of perspective, whether it's too much or ethically wrong or whatever. So we have to kind of just ignore the threat of being called conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers and all these crazy terms those are weaponized intelligence agency type words that are used to try and quieten down people who are pointing out the facts that are inconvenient. So I urge people to just brush those terms off. People will call you all these names, but facts are on your side. And when you confront people, in the end, they will have to agree that what you're alleging is not conspiracy, but a plan based on erroneous thinking and greed to do things that are wrong.
I completely agree. One of the final questions. So what we see in Europe is the weaponization of NGOs and of movements. And then you can name Black Lives Matters or Woke, the LGBTQ movement, Antifa, Extinction Rebellion. And I think those are the four horsemen of the apocalypse, you could almost say it. Do you see similar things in South Africa?
Of course, we have these, funding of all sorts of crazy NGOs promoting ideas that polarize the society. So, on so many dimensions. In recent years, an enormous amount of attention on gender-based violence, even though it's been declining linearly for about 50 years in South Africa. all of a sudden all men are toxic and all men are violent, and our children are being taught this in schools. And the organizations that are doing the teaching are not the normal teachers in the classroom. They're these creepy outside organizations sponsored by foundations like the Soros Foundation and so on. And what are they doing there? This is not innocent stuff. They're there to polarize. Why would you polarize? Well, if an elite is pursuing an agenda of control and power, that it helps them if the peasants are fighting with each other, if they're polarized. So I've been saying to people, look, this actually goes back a long way, and you need to start thinking again. Even the left-right dichotomy, I believe, is a false one. It's an artificial creation. It's, you know, the idea of a liberal versus a conservative, that's a false dichotomy. Conservative is the opposite of a revolutionary, and a liberal is the opposite of an authoritarian, you know. So what we have now is a situation where we desperately need to conserve liberal values against this tyrannical, authoritarian, totalitarian control that's emerging all over the planet. And we need to do it now. People need to wake up and forget about this damn virus, come out from under your beds and stand up to this overreach.
I completely agree again. So a final remark, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel, or any hope? Do you think things will get better?
Yes, I do. I think we're going to have the best time. When people wake up, we're going to go and fix a whole lot of things that were wrong. There's going to be massive institutional reform across the board in so many countries. I think all these health agencies are going to be torn down. I think the World Health Organization, that's at the moment trying to even tighten its grip through this process towards a treaty where it compels countries to do whatever it says whenever it declares another epidemic, which, by the way, it could do at any point in time by shoving enough highly sensitive PCR tests up the noses of enough people. There's always a virus in circulation, and you could just do another scare campaign and go, oh my goodness, RSV, adenovirus, whatever, influenza, another swine flu, whatever. And so they could do this at the drop of a hat, and that is a controlled organization. It's, you know, it's massively influenced by both the CCP and by the Gates Foundation. And, you know, citizens are insane if they accept that kind of loss of sovereignty, giveaway of sovereignty by their governments. So I think that kind of stuff is going to be ripped down, torn down. And a lot of these crazy things that you're pointing out, these organizations that have been propped up, claiming to be one thing, but actually being another. You know, Black Lives Matter isn't about Black lives. It's about a kind of polarization and the rollout of Marxist ideas. It's first about those things, and secondarily about making some points about racism.
Well, the good thing is that a lot of people of color or Black people are waking up to this. They see they're being used. Yes,
absolutely. I think many of them saw through it from the start. You do get the voices, but those voices get cancelled, and they're not highlighted on mainstream media because mainstream media is controlled by the same foundations, you know. So we're going to have to tear down a whole lot of things. And when I say tear down, I don't mean that in a violent way, but we have to rewrite the rules here. We need to decentralize. We need to make sure that this kind of centralized control can never happen again.
I agree. Any last words for the people in Holland?
I wish you all the best. I hope that...
Can you please do it in Afrikaans?
Ja, ik wens vir julle alles van die beste. En ek hoop dat julle vriende allemaal wakker word. Ons is saam met jou here in South Africa. And yes, I just wish everybody really to find a way, find the empathy, the gentle human nature that's required to bring people around to see the truth. This is not about shoving facts in their faces. It's not about scaring them with complication or complexity. You have to talk to people and divert their attention from the scary virus to this other major problem that's developing and that they should be concerned about. That is a thing worth fearing. The virus never was.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you.